Tonight's Writers Workshop. In tonight's session, we will continue to focus on story elements. Tonight's focus is pacing and point of view, and I'm very excited to welcome back editor and local author Hector Garg.
Hi, I was turning on my own mic. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great, wonderful. Okay, as Sala mentioned, my name is Hector Garg. I am a reviewer, editor, author, and dreamer of stories and books. I'm here to talk to you this evening about pacing and point of view in our writing. And a little bit of housekeeping before we start. You're more than welcome to take notes if you want, but I always post a condensed version of these talks on my blog about a week or so after we do this, these sessions. So if you want to wait for that to come out, I will definitely send Solemn the link to that, and you all will have that. If you want to take notes, that's fine too. I just wanted to put your mind at ease that you don't have to be like furiously writing the whole time. So let's get started. We're talking about pacing and point of view, and these are two different elements in writing mechanics. So I'm going to tackle them separately, and we will talk about pacing first. So it might seem obvious to say this, but pacing is the actual speed of a story. It's how fast or slow it's moving, kind of like the tempo in music. Even if you're not actively thinking about pacing when you read books or stories, you're experiencing it. A murder mystery goes fast, usually because there's some sort of ticking clock or deadline involved to make sure a victim is rescued. A romance often takes its time, especially in intimate scenes or those scenes where the two love interests are sharing their deepest thoughts. A slice of life story might bounce along at a mostly even speed, especially if an omniscient narrator is involved. So, pacing is the speed of your story. Like most things in writing, though, it's a lot easier said than done. But with enough practice and planning, you can make sure that your pacing fits the type of writing that you do and that it will work with the other mechanical elements in your story to keep your readers glued to the page or the screen. Before we jump into how to set the pace of a story, though, it's important to understand what kind of story you're writing. The word for this is genre. What genre is your story in? If you're not sure, or if you feel like your story could be labeled as more than one type, think about where you see it fitting with stories and books that are already on the market. These are called comparables or comps, and this exercise will be really helpful for you later if you plan to publish. So where do you see your story fitting with those other stories or books? If you think of your piece and had to put it on the shelf next to a published work, where do you see it fitting? What do you think sounds like your story? What do you think feels like your story? Another thing that you want to consider is where do you want your book to sit in a hypothetical bookstore? Do you want it in the historical fiction section because you love writing stories set in the past? Do you want it in the literary fiction section because you value well-written pages as much as the plot? Figuring out your genre is also about what's actually in the story you wrote. If your story has an elaborate magic system, then it will fall into fantasy. If your manuscript is about teenagers who are coming of age, then you're writing young adult. If your manuscript is about a murder, but there aren't really any bloody scenes, and there's a safety net under your characters, then it's a cozy mystery. Take the plot and characters in your story and boil them down to the absolute basics like this, and then see where those basics stack up against the marketplace. You should be able to figure out what genre you're writing in then. And if you still can't figure it out, then ask a writing friend or somebody you know who works in publishing to help. Once you know your genre, you can start considering the pacing of your story, because the two are definitely linked. We've already talked a little bit about this. Mysteries and thrillers have faster paces. Romances take their time. Paranormal stories might mix speeds depending on who is haunting when and where. This doesn't mean that once you know your genre that you have to stick to one pace, by the way. When we drive a car, for example, we go slow or fast depending on a variety of factors, like the traffic around us, the part of town we're in, and the weather. So think of your genre like the posted speed limit sign. Everyone can see it and know what it recommends, but occasionally you have to change things up because of other variables. Another element of your story that will determine your pace is what's taking place in your plot. In the genre of romantic suspense, there are definitely moments where readers might hold their breath as the main character is walking down a dark alley. There are also moments when the main character is talking to the person she's attracted to, and even though they might have vital information about the mystery at hand, all our protagonist can think about is how much they want to kiss that person. In those moments, for her, time will feel like it's stretched out. But why? Why do we feel like everything speeds up when we're in haunted houses or in the courtroom on the day of the verdict? And why do we feel like everything slows down when our two love interests are holding hands or when the sun is setting? Former literary agent and publishing expert Nathan Bransford says the answer is conflict. If a scene contains any conflict whatsoever, or even just the tension building up to that conflict, then the pace of the scene tends to go faster. That's okay. As soon as a conflict is brought up, we as readers start to ask questions, and we want answers. The longer the questions go without resolution, the higher the tension and the faster the pace. When we get an answer, we feel a sense of release, and everything slows down long enough for us to take a breath. And if you practice this long enough and you do it right, you won't give your readers a long time to breathe because you want them to start feeling the tension and the conflict again. So think about what's happening in your scenes and the conflict involved. A lot of times when people complain that a book or a movie was too slow, it's because there wasn't enough conflict, or even the suggestion of conflict, anywhere near that scene. The characters were more or less just sitting around and thinking or talking about stuff. We all have stuff in our lives, but we know that stuff doesn't make for compelling reading. Conflict, tension, and pursuing answers, along with proactive characters, amped up emotions, and dialogue that sounds like real people, all of these things are what keep readers engaged from start to finish. So let's talk about how we accomplish this, how to stretch out those moments or speed them up as the scene or the story require. Because it might seem like barreling toward a specific outcome is a good thing, but there's a reason why roller coasters aren't just one long free fall. Readers need some time to slow down, to think about what they've just experienced and brace themselves for the next huge drop or twist. So here are a few ways to change up the pacing depending on what you need to do in the scene. I've adapted this from Readsy, which is a fantastic community, one I highly recommend for you to get involved with. So here are their suggestions for switching up the pacing a few different ways. The first one is make your sentences different lengths. Longer sentences can lead readers through descriptions or even a character's thoughts. They allow us to settle in for a little bit. This is especially true in literary fiction, or what is sometimes called women's fiction. Katie Reagan's literary fiction novel, How to Find Your Way Home, is set in England and tells the story of a brother and his younger sister. The brother, Stephen, has been homeless for a long time, and his sister, Emily, works in social services. In fact, the main reason why Emily took the job in social work was because she hoped to find Stephen one day, and one day her wish actually does come true. She finds him. He resists her help at first, but eventually he caves and comes to her apartment. At the beginning of chapter 12, we get this sentence. Sorry about that. Well, you're just going to get a preview of all my slides, aren't you? There we go. All right. So the sentence from Katie Reagan's work. For that first weekend, he had slept like the dead, waking intermittently to find Emily sitting on the side of his bed with a cup of tea or bowl of soup, feeling simultaneously overwhelmed with gratitude and desperate for her to leave, so that he didn't have to go through the humiliation of her seeing him in this state. This sentence, as you can see, is really long. It clocks in at about 58 words. If every single sentence in this book, were this long, it would be exhausting to read. It would also drag out the story. But let's think for a minute about why this sentence construction works and why it helps with the pacing. First, as the sentence tells us, Stephen has spent the entire weekend, from Friday evening until Monday morning, as we find out later, sleeping. He hasn't done much else. So instead of giving us pages and pages of description about how he's just been in bed the entire time, author Katie Reagan has compressed the entire first weekend that Stephen has seen his little sister into a single sentence. Because really, he hasn't actually seen her, not in a way that they can have meaningful conversation or discuss what he's been living through, what he's been going through living on the streets. So the sentence itself might seem long, but it keeps the pacing of the chapter and the story moving. Also, after that second comma, we find out that Stephen has been half awake and half asleep the whole weekend. The word that Katie Reagan uses is intermittently. So anyone who's ever been really sick with COVID or the flu or something else that's kept you in bed for a while, you'll know that you exist in kind of this weird in-between state, during those first few days when you're ill. You're not fully awake, but you're not really asleep either, and your sense of time is all messed up. Here in this sentence, with all the clauses between commas, by the time we get to the end of it, we can almost feel that rhythm of waking up and falling asleep. When Stephen showed up at Emily's place, he was rip-roaring drunk. It's not the first time in his life that he's been this way. As he sleeps off all that alcohol, it's easy to understand that his sense of time will be all over the place. Katie Reagan recreates that for us in this sentence with how long it is and the mini pauses she adds with all those commas. As I said, though, we can't write in all long sentences or all short ones all the time. Both would be exhausting for different reasons. Even in literary fiction, where writers want us to linger over their words and images, authors will use sentences of varying lengths. Several paragraphs later, in the same chapter, when Stephen wakes up on Monday morning, the narration says, he could already feel the glorious calm of sobriety settling on him like a cool sheet. It was such a relief. These are two separate sentences, and the total word count here is 21 words, which is less than half of the previous sentence that we looked at. But again, the length of the sentences is a deliberate choice by Katie Reagan. After the rambling length of the longer sentences, Reagan is bringing Stephen and us, her readers, back to the reality of his life. If we go back to our analogy of being sick, once that fever breaks or we're on the positive side of recovery, there's always that sense of relief, isn't there? We may not be 100%, but we can sense that things are going to get better now. That's exactly the feeling Katie Reagan gives us here, and we can almost feel that cool sheet of recovery settling over us. She follows this up with an even shorter sentence, only 5 words long. It was such a relief. If she had wanted, she could have gone on for another paragraph or two about why or how it was a relief, but sometimes when we've fought through a really difficult time in our lives, the simplest explanation or description is really what fits best. In the last several years of the book, Stephen has been through a horrible time on the streets, and now he can finally just exhale. That sensation doesn't need fancy words or phrases. A simple, "it was such a relief," is good enough. We're talking about pacing, so what does using such a short sentence do to the pacing of a scene or a chapter? In this case, it gives us an opportunity to breathe. We don't know at this point in the book what's going to happen between Emily and Stephen. They've both shared enough with readers for us to know that they've really struggled without one another. And even though family is family, reuniting isn't exactly going to be the easiest thing to do. But here, in this moment, Katie Reagan is letting us off the hook just for a few lines so we can stop worrying for a little bit before we have to jump back into the challenges that these two characters are going to face with each other. The short sentence here, especially after coming the longer ones, gives us a chance to pause and absorb the fact that finally Stephen has come home. The second way to change up pacing in your scenes is to use descriptions to keep the pace interesting. And when we first think about it, it doesn't seem like description could help with the pacing of your story or book, but it absolutely can, especially if you use the description to drop little clues into your narration for readers. In The Woman in the Library by Solari, 4 strangers introduce themselves to each other in the Boston Public Library. Not long after they start talking, they hear a woman screaming, and eventually we learn that she's been murdered. The four strangers become friends, even though it's the weirdest of circumstances to be starting a friendship in. Winifred, who goes by Freddie, is our main character and a writer visiting from Australia on a writing fellowship. She hasn't been in the US long, so even though she's sorry that someone had to be murdered for it to happen, she's grateful for the three friends that she's met, Cain, Wit, and Marigold. What's more, as the friends keep meeting, Freddie develops a crush on Cain. Events by this point have started swirling in all sorts of unexpected ways. Even though it doesn't seem possible, the police seem to think that Cain has a connection to the murdered woman. Freddie believes he's innocent, so when he invites her out to movie and a dinner, she says yes. When the movie is done, Freddie, as the first-person point of view character, tells us, "We walk from the Brattle to an Italian place in Harvard Square. It's called Jake's, which admittedly does not immediately evoke the Mediterranean, but inside the aroma is rich and tantalizing. The decor is simple and traditional, small tables draped in checked linen, bentwood chairs, candles and bottles. A basket of bread, still warm from the oven, and a pat of butter are placed on the table as we sit down. I realize I'm starving." Right away, we get a sense of the setting for this date that isn't a date, but kind of is a date. Solari has done a fantastic job of putting us right there in Jake's restaurant. We can practically smell the bread and see the little tables. Notice too that the author has kept the pace moving along. She's taken us straight from the movie theater to the restaurant in a single paragraph. Instead of spending a long time detailing Freddie's anxiety about what she's feeling for Cain or anything else, Solari takes out that anxiety and saves it for later. The description here also seems to be trying to reassure us that everything is fine for now. Sure, there's a murderer on the loose, and the more time Freddie spends with her three new friends, the more it seems like one of them is connected to the victim. But for now, we can take a little breather. We're about to sit down to dinner with our protagonist and someone she has a crush on. This can't be all bad. Later in the book, as things start to get a little muddy for Cain in particular, the description conveys the low-level panic Freddie has started to feel. The police are closing in, practically naming Cain a suspect in the murder, and he's gone into hiding. Freddie tries to sit down to get some work done. After all, she's in America on a prestigious writing fellowship and needs to have some pages to show for her time in Boston. Freddie's at her computer, and she says, "Preoccupied with my own misery, I barely register the call alert on my computer at first. I'm not sure why I check it. The last thing I want to do is speak to someone, but I do open the app. The profile has no name or picture, but I can see now that the same number has attempted to connect with me 3 times. I accept the call and Cain's face appears on screen. He's outside, somewhere reasonably well lit because I can see him, the tree behind him, the people in the distant background." By this point in the book, we don't know whether Cain is innocent or guilty. We do know he's hiding something though, and Freddie feels the same way, even though she's fallen head over heels for him. In this paragraph of description, we can sense how conflicted she is, even if she doesn't say it in those exact words. The atmosphere isn't relaxed like it was earlier in the book. This isn't a cozy dinner for two. Freddie's scared for herself and Cain. The paragraph, though, takes its time to share all the details of how she accepts the video chat request, because Solari is building tension. There's conflict, like Nathan Bransford said, and we're dying for it to be resolved. So the author takes her time through the description, and the result is that we're glued to our seats, wanting to know what will happen next. The third way that you can change up pacing in your stories is to add backstory and introspection when your character needs a minute, or to fill in the gaps during those boring activities. Sometimes the tension gets too high for our characters, and they need a minute to absorb what's happening. Other times they're doing something boring, like pacing back and forth. Instead of saying your characters are scared or nervous, which doesn't really add anything to the story by using just those words, use the opportunities you have to give readers your additional information on the characters, the story, or both. In Other Birds by Sarah Addison Allen, there are several characters living in a small condo complex on the fictional Mallow Island off the coast of South Carolina. Charlotte is one of them, one of these characters. And early in the book, we learn that she's been working in the sugar warehouse. At one time, the warehouse used to be the place where candy makers on the island would store sugar for all their confections. Now, the warehouse is a creative space where local artists can work on their art and also sell their items. Charlotte had a booth there where she would apply henna in beautiful designs on people's hands, until she found out that the rent was going up and she was priced out. One of the other artists has helped her move out of the warehouse, but after he leaves her place, she discovers that a big chunk of her money, nearly $2,000, has gone missing. Charlotte goes back to the warehouse to see if she can track the guy down, and she runs into the manager, Asher. At one time, Charlotte and Asher were a thing. When they come face to face, Charlotte takes a minute to stare at him. The narration shares how they met and got together. Then it says, "It always happened this way. She would be alone for years because protecting herself from anyone who could hurt her was what teenage Charlotte had always wanted, and she owed that to her. Then along would come someone like Asher who showed her where all her cracks were." All Charlotte and Asher are doing is looking at each other. She's trying to figure out how to ask him about the guy who might have stolen her money without making herself sound needy or desperate to get back together. She's not interested in that, by the way, but she knows that Asher will feel that way. The narration is taking the time to tell us what Charlotte is thinking and feeling in this moment when she's vulnerable, when she really needs help, and she doesn't know where to turn. At one time, she thought Asher would take care of her. She knows now that that isn't going to happen, but even in this challenging time, she just needs to step back for a moment. The pace of the story allows us to do that. The narration reveals only a few pages before this that Charlotte ran away from home. So the pace gives us time to process that information, and it allows Charlotte some time to think about her relationship with Asher in this moment, even if it's over. Later, we learn that Charlotte isn't a regular runaway. She actually escaped a scary situation. She came to Mallow Island after bouncing around a bunch of other locations because she thought the island would be safe. Through the course of the book, we find out that someone has been breaking into her condo regularly, and she doesn't know who or why. She comes home after dinner with a friend to find out that yet again someone's been in her home. And the narration says, "She hated how close to the surface her fear still was after all these years, simmering like a watched pot. She tried to calm down by reminding herself that in her early days after running away, she had lived in a few dodgy places that had been broken into, and nothing had been taken because, like now, she didn't keep anything worth stealing. Benny had lucked out with the money she'd had on her that night." In this scene, Charlotte is taking a slow walk around her condo to see what's out of place. Author Sarah Addison Allen could have easily just told us that, but it's kind of boring to reveal the moment. Plus, it doesn't really add anything to the story to just say it in those words. Instead, the author takes the boring activity, Charlotte walking around her home, and brings us inside of her heart and mind. The pace of the scene matches the pace of Charlotte's thoughts, and it slows down everything long enough for us to wonder, yet again, just who is breaking into Charlotte's home and why. One of the most important things to do when we're thinking about pacing is to read other stories and books with a careful eye. Focus on the pacing of the plot. Think about what's going on in the scene and pay attention to the length of the sentences. See how much description is on the page and think about what the purpose of the description is. By practicing it in your own writing and paying attention to other people's work, you'll be able to control the pacing of your stories to make them even better. So, here were a few tips to help you with the pacing of your story. And now we're going to pivot to the other part of tonight's workshop, which is point of view. Just like pacing has a pretty easy definition, it's literally just the speed of your story, point of view also has a pretty easy definition. It's basically which character is telling your story at any given time. And, just like pacing, it requires some thought to incorporate effectively, because it might be easy to identify the point of view or POV in a story, but it's a lot more challenging to consider what point of view you should use. Before we get into that though, let's do a quick review of different types of POVs so everyone's up to speed on the basics. And the different types are determined by what pronouns we use. First person POV is where we use different forms of the word I. So I, me, my, our, we, and us. An example of this would be, I went to the store with my husband, we got chocolate chips, I hid in the pantry and ate all of them by myself. Second person POV is where the pronouns are in the various forms of the word you, like your and yours. And the example would be, you ate all the chocolate chips. Don't you know you could get a stomachache that way? You can go find the Pepto-Bismol all by yourself. In third person POV, we use the pronouns are the forms of the following words: he, she, it, they, them, their. And the example would be, he rolled his eyes at his wife. She lay on the sofa moaning. She swore off chocolate chips for the rest of her life. Well, until she went back to the store anyway. When we talk about point of view in writing, though, we're not just discussing grammar. Point of view is also about whose thoughts and feelings are filtering the story, and the fact that readers experience the story through that filter. So we really have to think about whose point of view will convey that story best and have the biggest impact on our readers. This is important because the point of view can change a story completely. A fantastic example of this is the Pixar film Inside Out, which is about a girl named Riley. Her family has just moved from Minnesota to San Francisco, and Riley is not happy about it. Pixar takes us through Riley's experiences by focusing on the emotions inside her: joy, anger, fear, disgust, and sadness. We see how Riley interprets situations depending on which emotion is controlling her at the moment, and the biggest interplay throughout the movie comes between joy and sadness. Joy is bound and determined to make the best of the move to California. Sadness really just wants to plop on the floor and declare that life is terrible and just sort of stay there. Joy believes that if she can keep Riley focused on the good things, everything will be fine. My absolute favorite moment in the film comes toward the end, when Sadness and Joy are discussing a memory of Riley's in which she's being cheered on by her hockey team back in Minnesota. The team is carrying Riley on their shoulders, and she's excited and happy. Joy mentions the memory more than once throughout the movie, but then Sadness reminds Joy of something important that goes right back to our discussion of point of view. When the hockey team was carrying Riley around, it wasn't because they had just won a huge game. In fact, they'd lost a game, even though Riley had tried to score before the buzzer. She missed, and she feels awful. After the game, her parents are comforting her, but Riley is really upset. Then her team comes and starts cheering her up. They put Riley on their shoulders to make her feel better because they don't want her to be sad anymore. Throughout the entire movie, we only see this memory from Joy's point of view, the happy moments when Riley is laughing and smiling with the team. But the minute we see the full memory, we realize just how much the point of view of that memory affects everything. Just like Riley's memory of that game matters, depending on whether joy or sadness is filtering it for her, the way our readers experience our stories matters, depending on what point of view we use for them. And the point of view you choose will have its advantages and disadvantages. So let's take a look at each type of point of view to see what makes them work and why we might want to think twice about using one over the other. We'll talk about first-person point of view first. Earlier, I mentioned the murder mystery, The Woman in the Library by Solari. This was the novel about Freddie, the writer who's come to Boston on a prestigious writing fellowship and meets three new friends in the Boston Public Library. They hear a woman scream and find out later that she was murdered. In the sections from Freddie, author Solari has chosen to tell the story from first-person point of view. As a general rule, when we write or read in first person, we can only have access to the information that the POV character has. And if you think about it, this makes sense. We're all the first-person point of view characters in our own lives. Even here tonight in the library, we all know that we're here for this workshop, but I don't know what all of you were doing before you sat down this evening, and you don't know what I was doing. I could have been here in the library all day. I could have just run in 5 minutes before we started. You don't know. The minute I start sharing the events of my day with you, though, you'll find out. and you'll have access to what I did before I got here, and, if I choose to share it, what I thought and I felt about it all. First-person point of view works the same way when you're writing. Your POV character can't have access to information that is outside the confines of their personal experience. In The Woman in the Library, Freddie is worried sick about Kane, who quickly becomes her boyfriend over the course of the book. Kane has to go into hiding from the police at one point, and even Freddie doesn't have any information about his location. It wouldn't make sense for her to say something like, even though Kane hasn't called me in 3 days, he's at home with his cell phone turned off and his computer unplugged. Freddie has no idea where Kane is, so she can't tell us, the readers. Mysteries and thrillers thrive on secrets and red herrings, on information coming in a little bit at a time. That's why so many of them are written in first person, to make it seem like the main character and the reader are working together to try to figure it all out. While the main character is dealing with life and information in one place, it's easy for the criminal to get away with something somewhere else because the protagonist doesn't have access to that information. First person also works well in romance. If fear is an emotion that we feel strongly, so is love. One reason romance novels do so well is because readers get to experience that sensation of falling in love or the early days of a new relationship over and over again. When we read first person in romance stories, it almost feels like the romance is happening to us. This might seem like a good thing, but it can also be a drawback if you want your readers to get a broader sense of the story. First person POV characters have no idea what's going on outside of their lives. If I don't share with you what I was doing and thinking before I got here, you won't know, so you couldn't write about it. In The Woman in the Library, we know what Freddie's thinking and feeling at any given point of time. We have no idea what the killer is doing or even who that person is. For a mystery, this works well because mysteries need that element of surprise to be engaging. For other genres, however, it creates some interesting problems. If a point of view character can only share what they see, hear, think, and feel about something, it'll be really hard to share a twist or surprise that is important to your story if your point of view character isn't there when it happens. Many novels that use first-person POV stick with it all the way through. This means your protagonist will have to be really determined in pursuing whatever story problem they're trying to fix. On the one hand, this could be a good thing because it means your main character will always be active. Passive characters are boring and don't make great protagonists. On the other hand, though, you have to be really careful not to share information that the protagonist wouldn't already know or discover on their own. The protagonist in a murder mystery can't suddenly know what's in a police file, for example, unless they're a cop and have access to that file. If they're not a cop, you have to have a really good reason as to why they have that access in the first place. First-person point of view is also considered incredibly intimate. So when you're getting ready to write a story and you're not sure whether you should write it in first person or not, ask yourself whether the reader would benefit from having access to everything inside your main character's head. Ask if your main character has what it takes to sustain an entire story on their own steam and merit. For short stories, writing first person is much easier because of the limitations of time and space. For a novel, it's a little bit harder, but it absolutely can be done. I mean, Suzanne Collins wrote the entire Hunger Games trilogy in first person. We have all of Katniss's thoughts and ideas about the Capitol and her role in the games. We have no idea, however, what President Snow was thinking when he was alone. We don't even know what Peeta and Gale, her two main love interests, were thinking or feeling, unless they told Katniss and us, the readers. The Hunger Games was an action-filled trilogy, but Suzanne Collins chose only to share what was inside Katniss's head. So when you're thinking of first person, consider how close you want your readers to come to the main character, and whether the story you're trying to tell will be served best by that close relationship. Second person point of view. When stories and books are written from a second person POV, it creates some challenges right out of the gate. You have to find a way to establish the relationship between the reader and the narrator almost immediately, and the narrator can't be you, the writer. It has to be a character within the framework of your plot. In addition to sections in first person, The Woman in the Library by Solari uses second person in a really interesting way. I already told you about the part where Freddie and her 3 friends are trying to figure out the mystery of the woman murdered in the Boston Public Library and how the police think Freddie's new boyfriend, Kane, is involved. What I didn't mention, though, is that within the world of the book, the story of Freddie and her friends is fiction. The woman in the library is actually about an author named Hannah Tigany, who is working on a book about 4 friends in the Boston Public Library and the murder mystery they get tangled up in. Hannah starts receiving letters from a very enthusiastic fan named Leo. Leo convinces Hannah to send him chapters of her new manuscript, and after almost every chapter, he sends her his thoughts on what she's written. These email letters are always written in second person, and author Solari sets the tone right from page 1 of the book. His letter starts, "Dear Hannah, what are you writing? I expect you've started something new by now. If not, consider this a nudge from a fan. You have a following, my friend, desperate for the next Hannah Tigany. To paraphrase Spider-Man, with great readership comes great responsibility." This is probably one of the first emails that Leo writes to Hannah, and right away the author gives us everything we need to know to jump into the story. Hannah Tigany is a famous author. We know this because Leo is comparing her to a superhero and says she has, quote, great readership. We also know that she's an author because of his first question, what are you writing? And when he says, consider this a nudge from a fan, we can assume that her work is popular enough that she is receiving fan mail regularly. This whole paragraph is in second person, and all of Leo's letters throughout the book are like this. He's talking directly to Hannah, but we never get her side of the correspondence. We only get his, and his letters alternate with the chapters of the book that Hannah is writing. What happens here is this really interesting interplay between the chapters of Hannah's book, which are in first person from Freddie's point of view, and Leo's letters, which are in second person. We can feel how Hannah must be feeling when she gets Leo's letters. It almost seems personal to the readers, and as the mystery unfolds of the murder that Freddie and her friends are trying to solve in Hannah Tigany's book, little by little we are made aware of another mystery. Why Hannah would continue to allow emails from Leo even though it becomes pretty clear this guy has a screw loose. Using second person point of view brings us even closer to the book and the plot. After a while, we find ourselves worried about both Freddie and Hannah, and the fate of both of them are tied to each other. That's the thing about writing in second person point of view. It has a different type of intimacy to it, and by using it, you, the writer, are making a promise to the reader that no matter what happens, you'll see it through together. You have to, because the minute that the relationship ends, the story's over. As the writer, you have to be mindful of sustaining that relationship all the way through from start to finish, which can be difficult. It's your job to provide your readers with enough information to know what's going on without them having access to a big part of your story on their own. It's also one of the reasons why many writing experts discourage new writers from using second person point of view in stories. It's not that it can't be done, it's just that the level of finesse and nuance that it's required is often a major challenge all on their own for new writers. If you want an example of how second person is done really well all the way through, I recommend reading The Reluctant Fundamentalist by Mosine Hamid. It's a little bit of a heavy book, but it's set in Pakistan, and the narrator is a man in a small restaurant who meets a visiting American and tells him a story. It's fascinating not only from a plot standpoint, but especially from a writing standpoint, and does a fantastic job of navigating all the challenges of second person point of view. So let's move on to our last POV to cover. Third person. It's probably the most widely used point of view that we see. The majority of stories and books are told with this he said, she said, they said setup. So readers don't even blink when they encounter a story using third person point of view. Earlier I mentioned the book Other Birds by Sarah Addison Allen. The majority of this novel is told in third person. Zoe Hennessy is the protagonist in the book, but Sarah Addison Allen also gives us some strong supporting characters, like Charlotte, whose stories we follow. Zoe arrives on Mallow Island. She's 18 years old and on her own. Her father and stepmother back in Oklahoma don't really have much of an interest in anything related to her, other than the fact that she just takes care of herself. Zoe comes to South Carolina because her late mother left her the rights to a condo there. She's going to go to college in South Carolina and use the condo as her home base, so she comes in the summer before school starts so she can get settled in. It seems like this kind of story about a teenager trying to find a connection with an absent parent while also making her way in the world would be perfect for first-person point of view. And it's possible if another author had tackled it, they might have chosen first person. Sarah Addison Allen uses third person for very specific reasons, however. First, by taking a step back from Zoe, by not spending time inside her head for every page, the author allows us actually to get closer to our protagonist. Sometimes when we're dealing with difficult situations, we're so close to them that we can't be objective about what's happening. Here, though, the third-person POV allows us access to that objectivity. When Zoe arrives, she goes to the small condo building called the Delawisp, where her mother once lived. The day after she gets there, another one of the Delawisp residents dies. The manager of the Delawisp asks Zoe if she'd like a summer job cleaning out that resident's condo. The narration tells us, she hesitated, feeling suddenly emotional. It seemed a lot to unload on him, how she'd always imagined her mother's condo to be a time capsule, and that was what she thought she'd be doing this summer, falling into the soft, comforting history of her dead mother. She was still trying to process the fact that what she knew might be all she would ever know, and there would be no guidance on where she came from or where she should go from here. We're getting Zoe's thoughts and feelings, but we're also getting the polished objectivity of third person. Coming to the place where her mother spent important years of her life is an emotional experience for Zoe. If this section had been in first person, we may not have gotten such a clean-cut look at how she's handling it. Also, by using third-person point of view here, Sarah Addison Allen takes the opportunity to inject a little bit of backstory. Zoe always assumed that once she got to the condo, she'd discover everything she wanted to know about her mother, who died when she was 7. Now, it seems that won't happen, and she has to deal with that. Third-person POV allows us to stand next to her like a friend, instead of facing it from inside her head when the jumble of emotions and fears and everything else that a situation like this can bring. The book also benefits from third-person POV because the author doesn't just want us to get to know Zoe. She also wants us to get to know other characters connected to the Delawisp. Zoe is our protagonist, but these other characters are going to be important to her as the book progresses. By keeping Zoe in third-person point of view and dealing with these other characters in third person, Sarah Addison Allen is giving readers a subtle clue about how necessary they all are to the story she's trying to tell. Zoe's life is going to change because she's come to South Carolina, but the lives of these other characters are also going to change because they met her. If the author had written Zoe in first person, she would have implied that Zoe is way more important than they are. But this book is as much about the other residents and the Delawisp as it is about Zoe. So, that's a look at third person. I would like to take a minute to talk about a subset of third-person POV. This contains third-person omniscient and third-person limited. In the most technical sense, third-person omniscient is supposed to be from the point of view of an all-knowing or omniscient narrator. You get the thoughts and feelings of all of the characters. Third-person limited also includes multiple characters, but the narration leans toward one character more than the others, so we know that that person is our protagonist. In all honesty, the lines between third-person omniscient and third-person limited point of view are kind of blurry. I could say that Other Birds by Sarah Addison Allen is an example of third-person omniscient because we have full access to what all the characters are thinking when they're reading the story from their points of view. By the end of the book, we know pretty much everything important there is to know about the people who live at the Delawisp. However, some people might say that Other Birds is third-person limited because when we're spending time with one character, we're fully in their hearts and minds and with no one else. We can guess what the other characters are thinking and feeling based on what the POV character observes, but we don't know for sure. My advice for third-person POV is not to stress too much about whether it's omniscient or limited. I would say, though, that it's important to stay away from head hopping. Head hopping is basically where you're sharing one character's thoughts and feelings, and then in the middle of a paragraph or a scene, you switch to another character without any transition whatsoever. Some people might call this true third-person omniscient. I just think it makes readers dizzy. The start of a story or a book is, in some ways, a promise you're making to your readers. Whose point of view you share the story in is a way of indicating who the most important character is. If you keep bouncing from one character to another without any clues that you're about to change perspectives, readers will get confused. They won't know who to pay attention to, who they should give their sympathy to, and, most importantly, who they should give their time to. Writers are asking readers to give up precious minutes or hours from other parts of their lives, so we have to make the experience worthwhile. If we make mistakes like head hopping, we'll end up giving our readers a reason to hop right on to something else. You may have read stories where the author uses a mix of points of view. The Woman in the Library does this, and so does Other Birds. When the authors change points of view, though, they've done so thoughtfully and with intention. To focus your energy on writing the best story you can and spending time and care on each character. When you choose a particular point of view, commit to it for that section of your story. By doing that, readers will find themselves compelled to stick with your characters all the way to the end. I know that was a lot to get through this evening, and I really appreciate your time and attention. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you ever have any questions, you want to discuss a writing project. I'm always happy to answer questions and brainstorm ideas. And if you have any questions now, I'm happy to take them for you. Yes?
I tried to read Woman in the Library.
Yes.
And the letters drove me nuts.
Why is that?
Because I was ready to see this murder, and on the description of the book it says that they're in this library.
Right.
A woman screams and it's going to be a murder.
Yeah.
And you thought, great.
Right.
But then this letter jumps in here.
Yeah.
And it really takes you into another thing that I didn't want to go into.
Yeah.
And I had to put it down. So I picked it back up, and I started reading again, and I was going through it, and here comes this daggone letter. The letters are driving me nuts because it takes me out of the role I want to be in as a reader in terms of reading a mystery.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, it's a risk that the author took, right? Because it's what we call a frame story. So she is actually using the letters as a frame around the murder mystery. And if you're patient with it, then you'll figure out that it's really a story within a story, and both of those stories connect to one another. But I totally get it. I mean, it's not for everybody, right? Because some of us we want our murder mysteries straightforward and, you know, start to finish.
That was it. And I'll probably pick it up again, but it just got me.
Give it a try. I mean, but just keep that in mind, that it's a frame story. It's not like a traditional murder mystery. Yeah.
I wanted to add to that sometimes, you know, when they bounce like a chapter, you know, Anne, and then they'll go from Anne's point of view, and then it'll be Bob, you know, and they'll have one character that's just much duller than the other ones.
Yeah.
And you're just like, oh no, it's Bob, you know, what else can I do right now?
I have found myself skimming chapters like that. But, you know, even if you don't finish the book, because I am definitely the type of person, I used to be very committed to reading books from start to finish, and then I was like, there are just way too many books to read in the world. So I have a very methodical way of deciding where I'm going to stop reading. Even if you do stop reading, though, I would say use that as a learning opportunity. Step back and think, why would the author include this person? How do they contribute to the story? And it's okay for you to say, you know what, they don't contribute anything at all. It's one of the best things about stories and books, right, is that we can be subjective, and we can all have our own point of view and be right about it. You know, we don't have to like something that our best friend or our child or spouse or whoever likes. So, but definitely think about, you know, when you run across something like that, step back and say, why is the author doing this? What is the point here? So, any other questions, comments, concerns? Anything about writing. It doesn't have to be about pacing and point of view. Yeah.
So you mentioned the example of the second-person book is The Reluctant
Fundamentalist.
Fundamentalist.
It's a little bit of a heavy read because it is about post 9/11, and that was quite a tumultuous time for a lot of different people. But yeah, it surprised me because it's written in second person, and we normally don't read books. It's, like I said, it's very difficult to do well. But definitely give it a try. Yes.
Can you speak to the short story format, point of view with short story? Is everything you shared tonight the same for short stories, or are there different trends or like different, certain point of view more popular with short story versus novels? Since we've got a short story competition coming up.
Right. I think for short stories, people tend either towards first person or third person. I would say probably, at least the websites and things that I read short stories on, I see more third person. That doesn't mean you can't write in first. To go back to the earlier part of your question, writing is writing. So all of the tips and advice that I've given, it applies to writing no matter what length you're writing to. Whether it's a short story, whether it's a novella, whether it's a novel, absolutely. But sometimes the thing with short stories is that it's a limited time and space, right? So that's why you have to think really hard about what point of view you want to use and the pacing of it, because we don't have the luxury of a really long, 200, 300, 400 pages. So definitely think really hard about what it is you're trying to accomplish in the story. And with pacing, think about what details are important to share and how can you get to them. If it's a romance, how can you take your time and stretch it just a little bit, but not make it feel like it's falling flat. And for that, I would definitely recommend sharing it with a writing friend and being like, hey, can you read this and tell me, I'm sort of working on pacing here. Can you tell me what you think? Trying to work on the point of view. Do you think first person works here? Do you think I need to, switch it to something else? So does that help?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anything else? Yes.
As a new writer, how do you get writing friends? How do you start finding writing resources? I mean, this is a great one, but what are some other ones that you'd recommend?
The Writer magazine is a great resource. It's one that I've recommended many times over. I adore that magazine. Poets and Writers is another good magazine. It's a little bit heavier though. I had a subscription for a year and I decided to let it go just because I think for more, Poets and Writers I think feels more like towards the literary side of things, and if you're writing genre fiction it may not be quite right for you. And I tend to write more genre fiction than I do literary. As far as writing friends, I'll be your writing friend. I can give you my card and then we can connect with other friends and yeah, absolutely. Solomon and I were talking earlier about hanging out at the literary.
I would love that.
Yeah, absolutely. Just, go to the literary and, we can meet at the literary. And, but yeah, we can connect afterwards.
Cool.
Yeah. Yes, Louise.
Well, I just want to say there's a couple local groups.
Yes, there are.
I belong to a critique group,
Okay.
and there are about 10 of us. We meet on Zoom right now.
Hmm.
And we may continue to meet on Zoom because some of our members have spread out to other parts of the country. And they wouldn't be able to join us. But we started meeting here. And it was actually the result of one of these writers' workshops.
Yeah, it was.
We all put in our email addresses if we were interested. So if anyone is interested, I'll be happy to give you my email address and you can contact me. And another thing is Shut Up and Write. Shut Up and Write it's literally what it says. You just get together, you don't share your work, you just shut up and write. But you do make contacts and form friendships, and that's a positive thing.
Yeah, those are great. Thank you.
There's also another group that meets here at the library called the Red Herring Writing Group. I believe they meet here every Thursday, but yeah, they meet at the library regularly. I want to say they meet at 6 o'clock, but I can check for you.
And also, if anybody's old enough, our
has a separate membership.
you know.
That's good to know.
They offer lots of interesting classes.
What time is that critique, do you know? Is it during the day or is it after the evening? For Ollie?
I don't know.
Yeah.
The one I went to, it was a while back, wasn't evening thing.
Anything else? Questions? Anything writing related? Like I said, doesn't have to be about pacing or point of view.
You mentioned a few genres, and I thought your descriptions were really great. Are there any other resources out there that like lists like short descriptions of genres?
Let's see. Look up Nathan Bransford. He is he's the former agent that I mentioned before. He has a great blog which has a lot of really good information. Jane Friedman also is another great resource, and both of them do a really good job of taking information and boiling it down to really bite-sized pieces. So check out both of their websites and start there. Yes.
Hi, I'm wondering, how long did it take you to write and publish your first book, and what was it like for other books after that?
So how long did it take me to write the first one? I guess it depends on, do you mean from the very first time I started writing and then finished it all the way through? Because that was actually, I started it 9 years ago. Elves came out of a conversation or, watching the Polar Express with my children. And I just started asking myself some questions about the story, and then I kind of forgot about it for a little while. And then I started pantsing my way through a story about elves, and that didn't really work either because I'm not a pantser by nature. I like to plan things, and so I'm also a plotter. But I do I'm not the type of plotter. I know some people like to meticulously plot down to every single scene. I can't do that. But I do need to know where my story is going and where it ends up. So I kind of went back to it and I started tinkering with it and did some research. Because I started asking questions about, so the book is actually about a part-time elf named Curtis who used to be a pilot. And so I started asking questions about pilots and what on earth, what kind of connection they would have with Santa and, this whole idea of Christmas. And the first couple of drafts actually came pretty fast. I would say maybe 2 or 3 months. And then it was one of those things where I put it back down again and I picked it back up. From the time that I submitted it to my publisher on January 1st, 2021, until I got the yes, it was about 2 months. And then from the time that I got the contract until it was actually on the market, it was about 7 months. So it came out in October of 2021. And it's a story of my heart, absolutely, for sure. It's a story for grown-ups, by the way. I don't think that children should have the market on Christmas and elves and all that fun stuff. Like, that's not fair. Why is it that once we get past 18, we have to give up fun, magical stuff like that? Definitely a book for grown-ups. As far as the next book that is going to be published, hopefully in February, that's something that I started working on several years ago. I had just finished reading The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, which I absolutely adore. And I finished it, and the first thought was, I wish I could go to the night circus. The second thought was, that kind of felt like a fairy tale. I wonder if I could write a fairy tale. And so I decided to start playing around with the idea of what a fairy tale is and what does that mean. And just like with elves, kind of trying to turn convention upside down just a little bit, because I didn't want to write something that was, and they lived happily ever after. I'm like, okay, that's kind of boring. What happens after the ever after? What if the king did find the love of his life and he lost her? What happens then? And so in the first chapter, his queen dies. It's like, but this is supposed to be a fairy tale, right? There's supposed to be a happy ending. What happens next? And so I started asking myself those questions, and that became In the Heart of the Linden Wood, which hopefully will come out in February. And it was just a matter of just asking questions and just being really curious and saying, okay, but what about this? Okay, but what about this? And the key to developing any story idea is to play what actors like when they do improv, what they call the yes and game. So when they do improv, if somebody says something to you, asks you a question, your answer can't be no, it has to be yes. You say yes, and then you build on that. And so when you're brainstorming a new story, that's the way you do it, is you don't limit yourself, saying, oh, but this doesn't make sense. Oh, that would, that's totally implausible. Doesn't matter. In the brainstorming phase, everything is okay. Everything is game. You can always go back later and kind of, cull the ideas. But when you're first starting out, let your imagination run wild. And that's what I did with the fairy tale story. And I worked with a writing mentor from the University of Wisconsin through a program that they had, which no longer exists, which makes me very sad. It was one of the tragedies of COVID that they killed that program from the university. But I just started asking questions, and it just started coming. And so now that is going to be coming out soon, I've started thinking about what I'm writing next. And again, it's going back to another story idea that I had a while ago, and I'm going to play the yes and game and say, what if I did this? Okay, yes, and what happens next? And then yes, and what happens next? And when you play that game, it might seem like it just kind of leaves the entire world open, but it actually doesn't. What it does is it starts to lead you down certain story paths, because you start to realize that if A has to happen, then B has to happen because of A. And if B happens, then C has to happen because of B. And you just keep following it down. Does that help? Does that make sense? Okay, all right. Anything else?
Why is there no sequel to The Night Circus?
I don't know. That's a good question. And I know that it's been optioned for a movie. I don't know if it's actually going to get made into a movie. I feel like it's one of those books that might be hard to make into a movie and to do it well. But yeah, I've always wondered about Bailey and like what would happen with him and how he would bring the circus into the future, right? Because we get that email address at the end. I'm like, I want to send him an email and be like, Bailey, where are you? Bring the circus, please. So, anything else? I'm happy to chat. I could talk writing all day long. I'm the only writer in my house, so, I love to meet other writers and,
Well, thank you so much, Ekta. That was wonderful. I do want to give a few quick reminders. For the next workshop, we will be back in this room on October 19th. We will be continuing with story elements. So the next one is conflict and resolution, 7 p.m. And I do want to mention our 4th annual short story contest is open. We are accepting submissions. Just go to champaign.org/writers, and there you can find prize information, guidelines for your story, and deadlines, and hope to see you at the next workshop.